Hey guys, welcome back to the channel Historical Tales for Sleep. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of dread in your bones. A lord's shadow looms over your hearth, his justice dispensed with steel and terror. You are not just poor, you are powerless. This was life under ruthless rulers' oppression, corruption, and war without end. Empire of fear, rulers above the law across medieval Europe and feudal Japan. Rulers ruled without mercy. In Europe, nobles quelled dissent with terror, mutilation, or mass execution, exercising authority through fear. In Japan, shoguns and daimyos enforced strict obedience, using land surveys and mobility bans to crush resistance. Feudalism in medieval Japan. Feudalism in medieval Japan, 1185 to 1603, is the relationship between lords and vassals, where land ownership and its use were exchanged for military service and loyalty. Although present earlier to some degree, the feudal system in Japan was really established from the beginning of the Kamakura period in the late 12th century. The Japanese shoguns, or military dictators, replaced the emperor and imperial court as the country's main source of government. The shogunates then distributed land to loyal followers, and these estates, shun, were then supervised by officials such as the Gito stewards and shugo constables. Unlike in European feudalism, these often hereditary officials, at least initially, did not own land themselves. However, over time, the Gito and shugo, operating far from the central government, gained more and more powers, with many of them becoming large landowners, daimyo in their own right, and with their own private armies. They challenged the authority of the shogunate governments. Feudalism as a nationwide system thus broke down, even if the lord-vassal relationship did continue after the medieval period in the form of samurai offering their services to estate owners. Origins and structure. Feudalism, Hoken Seido, that is, the arrangement between lords and vassals where the former gave favor or on, for example, land, titles, or prestigious offices in exchange for military service, giri from the latter, began to be widespread in Japan from the beginning of the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333. The main instigator was Minamoto no Yoritomo, 1147 to 1199, who had established himself as the military dictator or shogun of Japan in 1192, replacing the dominance of the Japanese emperor and the imperial court. The new system saw Yoritomo distribute land, which was often confiscated from defeated rivals, to his loyal followers and allies in return for their military service and continued support. Yoritomo was particularly adept at enticing members of the rival Taira clan to the Minamoto cause by offering them land and positions if they agreed to be his vassals in the new order. Unlike in Europe, the feudal system of Japan was less contractually based and a much more personal affair between lords and vassals, with a strong paternalistic influence coming from the former, who were often referred to as oya or parent. This family feel was further strengthened by the fact that many lord-vassal relationships were inherited. The system allowed the shogun to have direct control of most of his territory, but the lack of formal institutions of government would be a lasting weakness of the shogunates, as personal loyalties were rarely passed on to successive generations. Jitosone of the loyal followers of the shogun received many estates, shuben, which were often geographically disparate or distant from their traditional family homes, and so, rather than manage them directly themselves, they employed the services of an appointed steward Gito for that purpose. Gito and shugo, see below, was not a new position but had been used on a smaller scale in the Heian period, 794-1185, and appointed by the shogunate government. They became a useful tool for managing land, taxes and produce far from the capital. Here too is another difference with European feudalism, as stewards never officially owned land themselves. That is, until the wheels started to come off the feudal system. Jito literally means head of the land, and the position was open to men and women in the early medieval period. Their principal responsibility was to manage the peasants, who worked their employers' land and collect the relevant local taxes. The steward was entitled to fees about 10% of the land's produce and tenure, but was often bound by local customs and also held accountable to such national law codes as the Gosabai Shikimoku 1232. In addition, aggrieved landowners and vassals could, from 1184, turn to the Monchuho Board of Inquiry, which looked after all legal matters including lawsuits, appeals, and disputes over land rights and loans. In 1249, a high court, the Hik, was formed, which was especially concerned with any disputes related to land and taxes. Many Jito eventually became powerful in their own right, and their descendants became daimyo, or influential feudal landowners, from the 14th century onwards. These daimyo ruled with a large degree of autonomy, even if they did have to follow certain rules laid down by the government, such as where to build a castle. Sugoanatha, layer of estate managers, was the shugo, or military governor or constable, who had policing and administrative responsibilities in their particular province. In the 14th century, there were 57 such provinces, and so a shugo was involved in several estates at once, unlike the gito, who only had one to worry about one. A shugo, literally meaning protector, made decisions according to local customs and military laws, and, like the Jito, they collected regular taxes in kind for the shogunate government, a portion of which they were entitled to keep for themselves. They were also charged with collecting special taxes tanzan for one-off events, like coronations and temple building projects, and organizing labor for state projects, like building roads and guest houses along the routes. Other responsibilities included capturing pirates, punishing traitors, and calling up warriors for use by the state, not only in wartime, but also as part of the regular rotation system where provinces supplied guards for the capital, Hyangyo, Kyoto. Over time, the position of shugo became, in effect, one of a regional governor. The shugo became ever more powerful, with taxes being directed into their own pockets, and such rights as collecting the tanzan often being given to subordinates as a way to create an alternative lord-vassal relationship without any land exchange being involved. The giving out of titles and organizing private arrangements with samurai also allowed the shugo to build up their own personal armies. Following the failed Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, shugo were legally obliged to reside in the province which they administered for greater state security, but whether this was always carried out in practice is unclear. By the 14th century, the shugo had also assumed the responsibilities of those Jito who had not become daimyo, and by the 15th century CE, most shugo inherited the position. Weaknesses of the feudal system. Of the problems for the Jito and shugo was that their authority out in the provinces, far from the central government, often relied on the goodwill of the locals. And when the shogunate government was weak, as it often was, samurai warriors and ambitious, landowners often ignored demands for taxes, or even took matters into their own hands and overturned the established arrangements of lord and vassal to increase their own power and wealth. An additional weakness in the system was that Jito and shugo depended entirely on local sources for their income, not the central government, and this meant that they often made entirely self-interested arrangements. Thus, the shogunate itself became a largely irrelevant and invisible institution at a local level. Farmers often made private deals with officials, giving, for example, a small parcel of land in exchange for a delay in payment of taxes or a negotiated percentage in order to pay their expected fees annually. As a consequence, the whole setup of land ownership in Japan became very complex indeed, with multiple possible landowners for any stretch of land, private individuals, vassal and non-vassals, government officials, religious institutions, the shogunate, and the crown. Yet another problem was that when Geto inherited from their fathers, there was often not enough money to make a living. If the rights of income had to be distributed amongst several siblings, this situation led to many Geto getting into debt as they mortgaged their right of income from a given estate. There were additional weaknesses to the feudal system as time wore on, too, namely the difficulty in finding new land and titles to award vassals in an era of stable government. In the Sengoku period, or Warring States period, 1467 to 1568, Japan suffered from constant civil wars between the rival daimyo warlords with their own private armies, who knew they could ignore the shugo and other officials of the government, which was now impotent to enforce its will in the provinces. Land was also ending up in fewer and fewer hands as the daimyo with most military might swallowed up their smaller rivals. By the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, there would be a mere 250 daimyo across the whole of Japan. The phenomenon of new rulers overthrowing the established order and of branch families taking the estates of the traditional major clans became known as Gikukuyo, or those below overthrowing those above. The consequence of this social and administrative upheaval was that Japan was no longer a unified state but had become a patchwork of feudal estates, centered around individual castles and fortified mansions as loyalties became highly localized. Villages and small towns, largely abandoned by the government, were obliged to form their own councils, and leagues of mutual assistance, iki. Not until Oda Nobunaga, 1534 to 1582, who defeated his rival warlords in the central part of the archipelago in the 1560s, did Japan begin to look like a unified country again. With the arrival of the much stronger Tokugawa shogunate 1603 to 1868, the daimyo were finally put in their place and severe restrictions imposed on them. These included a ban on moving their troops outside of their area and not being able to make political alliances in their own name, build more than one castle, or marry without the shogun's approval. The feudal system did, nevertheless, continue in the guise of samurai swearing loyalty to their particular daimyo up to the Meiji period 1868 to 1912. Even if there was now a prolonged period of relative peace and military service, was less needed than in medieval times. From the 17th century, then, the Japanese feudal system was, instead of being a nationwide pyramid structure of land distribution, largely one of local samurai warriors offering their services to a large estate owner or warlord in exchange for use of land, rice, or cash. It is for this reason that the Bushido or Samurai Warrior Code was developed, which aimed to ensure samurai remained disciplined and loyal to their employers. Meanwhile, increasing urbanization as people moved from rural life into the cities with their greater employment opportunities, and the ever-rising number of those involved in trade and commerce meant that the old feudal system was applicable to fewer and fewer people as Japan moved into the modern era. Feudal Japan for centuries. Japan was ruled by an emperor who claimed to be the grandchild of the sun goddess, Amat. The emperor was seen as divine, but by the 1100s, he was more like a fancy hood ornament, nice to look at, but not actually driving the car. The real power belonged to the shogun, a military leader who ran the show while the emperor performed ceremonies and enjoyed the perks of being worshipped. The political system that developed was feudalism, where land meant power and society was divided into strict social classes. The shogun handed out land to daimyo, who were basically mini-kings ruling over their territories. Each daimyo had an army of samurai to enforce laws and keep order. Below them were farmers, merchants, and artisans who kept the economy running. Everyone had a role, and moving up the social ladder was about as likely as winning the lottery. Falling down the ladder, though, that could happen in an instant and usually with a lot of sharp swords involved. While this system brought some order, it didn't exactly lead to peace. Daimyo were constantly fighting over land, forming alliances, and backstabbing each other. For centuries, Japan was a patchwork of territories in a never-ending power struggle. The strongest daimyo might win for a while, but someone was always waiting in the wings to knock them down. The birth of feudalism in Japan. Feudalism in Japan kicked off in the late 1100s with Minamoto no Yorimoto, a military leader who decided the emperor should stick to ceremonies while he ran the country. In 1185, Yorimoto became the first shogun, a title that basically meant supreme military boss. To keep things running, he divided Japan into districts ruled by daimyo, who were loyal to him. This setup worked for a while. Daimyo managed their land, collected taxes, and commanded armies of samurai. In theory, they answered to the shogun, but in practice, many daimyo acted like independent rulers. By the 1400s, things got messy. The Sengoku period, 146–71615, or Warring States period, was full of battles, betrayals, and shifting alliances, basically a medieval version of Game of Thrones, but with more swords and less talking. Leaders like Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi started bringing order to the chaos. Finally, Tokugawa Ieyasu took control in 1603, launching the Tokugawa shogunate and kicking off a long era of peace called the Edo period. The skinny on the samurai until the introduction of the European musket in the 16th century, 1500 to 1599. The weapons of the samurai were his two swords, leather-plated armor, a helmet, and a bow and quiver if he was trained as an archer. The sword was the most important weapon for a samurai. In fact, some believed it held his soul. Samurai carried not one but two swords. The long blade was called a katana, and the shoto is the short blade. Anything smaller than a shoto would be called a tonto knife. A samurai never unsheathed his sword when not in battle. To do so was considered extremely rude. When entering another samurai's house, you were expected to leave your long sword at the door but were permitted to keep your short sword with you. A peasant could even be killed without question for possessing or handling a samurai's sword. Japanese boys and sometimes girls could become samurai from any family. A boy chosen for samurai training would leave his family around the age of 7 to train with a teacher. The bond between student and teacher was strong, and the student was expected to master skills of sword fighting as well as mental games that taught critical thinking. A teacher might sneak up on their student and hit them with a stick to enforce the lesson that a samurai must always be on his guard. Bushido, the way of the warrior, like the code of chivalry in Europe that told the knights in medieval how to behave. The samurai, known as bushi, also lived by a code of conduct called Bushido, the way of the warrior. The code of Bushido was simple. A samurai's duty was to serve and obey his daimyo until death. The samurai was a part of the ruling warrior class and was expected to help keep the peasants in line. make sure that the harvest was collected, and to protect their daimyo's land from invaders. The daimyo controlled the people under him. Before someone could get married or leave his territory, they had to get his permission. Any reflection of disloyalty or cowardice was a reflection on the daimyo. To dishonor your daimyo is to bring shame upon your whole family. Shame could be passed down for generations, and therefore many samurai chose the ultimate sacrifice, seppuku, rather than bring shame upon themselves. Seppuku involved a complex ceremony where a samurai would face a painful death with absolute calm. Only samurai could carry the two swords, one long and one short. During seppuku, the samurai would slice open his belly in an L-shaped pattern, being careful to show no pain. Almost instantly, another warrior, probably a close friend, would act as second to cut off the head of the dying samurai to avoid prolonged pain. In this way, a disgraced samurai could ensure that his wife and children would not be outcasts. Ninja, ronin, and other sneaky stuff. Samurai without a lord was considered to be one of the lowest ranks in feudal Japan. A samurai's only mission was to serve his lord, and to not have a lord meant that you were dishonorable or had abandoned your duties. Such samurai, known as ronin, existed throughout Japan. Ronin often hired themselves out to daimyo as mercenary soldiers, but were never fully trusted. Some highly specialized ronin and samurai were like the Green Berets are today in America. These special ops forces were sent often on suicide missions to assassinate enemy daimyo, engage in spy missions, sabotage, or in some way make life difficult for the enemy. These elite fighters are known as shinobi, one who steals away. You may never have heard of shinobi, but you probably have heard of the more popular, even though the title was never used during their time, name of ninja. In contrast to a samurai, who fought by strict rules of honor, the ninja could pretty much do whatever was necessary to get the job done. The ninjas, like other ronin, lived in their own separate communities with their own rank and peasants. They were technically outside of the samurai system and therefore illegal. However, in a world filled with castles defended by big walls, sometimes a late-night poisoning gets the job done better than a 6-month siege. Even though most people think of ninjas as wearing black suits and face masks, this attire was best left for covert night jobs. Most ninja were hired not for assassinations, but for gathering intelligence from the enemy. Walking into a castle wearing a black ninja suit was a surefire way to get yourself arrested. Ninja dressed in everyday clothing and were skilled at the art of conversation in order to make friends with their target. Their main objective was to earn the trust of their target and safely deliver intel back to the daimyo who hired them. In this way, many women served as ninja. Often they would work in tea houses or as geisha to entertain and collect the gossip from samurai, who had a little too much sake to drink. Buddhist warrior monks and the art of zendis, despite their violent career choices, most samurai lived a life of quiet contemplation. A samurai was expected to neither yell nor argue nor get excessively drunk. At least that was the ideal. Many samurai found solace in Zen Buddhism, which makes the story of the samurai so very interesting. Where else do you have warriors who not only bravely slit their own bellies open, but are skilled flower arrangers? Buddhism came to Japan from China around 500 CE. The Chinese style of Buddhism, called Chan, focused heavily on meditation and quiet reflection as a way of reaching nirvana. This style became known as Zen when it reached Japan. Zen Buddhism focuses on meditation. Samurai warriors would spend hours sitting in absolute silence, either staring at a wall, arranging flowers, painting natural landscapes, or having tea. Entire rituals with their specific rules evolved from Zen Buddhism. The goal of arranging flowers, or painting a mountain, or drinking tea is not to just be quiet, but to focus all of your energy, your entire being on this one act. So why would a warrior care so much about being calm? Isn't it their job to kill people? A battlefield is a chaotic place where one wrong move or look can send you back to be reincarnated. Being able to control your thoughts, you become a better warrior. However, when it came time to die, it was seen as honorable to die silently and with dignity. The merchants in medieval Japan. Japan has had a long and rocky relationship with its larger neighbors across the sea. China looked down on Japan as an inferior land of barefooted barbarians. The Japanese in turn saw their island as the birth of the sun and viewed outsiders as barbarians. Both nations also went through long periods of isolationism where a distrust of foreigners ran high. This was followed by a period of openness when trade flourished. The Japanese have made selective borrowing an art. From China, the Japanese have borrowed many ideas and inventions from Confucianism and Buddhism to silk, chopsticks, and gunpowder. For centuries, China has been Japan's biggest trading partner until the 20th century when the United States took China's place. Chinese pottery, silks, bamboo, copper, and iron kettles were sent east, and in return, the Japanese exported beautiful ceremonial fans and handcrafted samurai swords. The Japanese also borrowed from China its prejudice against the merchant classes. The Japanese believed that the merchant classes were parasites because they neither produced food like the peasants nor protected the country like the samurai. The merchants grew rich from selling other people's goods and charging interest on money they loaned. It's a bit ironic that merchants held such low status in feudal Japan because their trade increased the wealth of the country and brought new goods and luxuries that the samurai depended on. Merchants sometimes also lent money to help pay for a daimyo's army or building project. However, merchants and their families were not trusted and so were restricted from owning land, living in certain parts of the city, or having a title of honor. The biggest irony is that merchants paid few taxes because their work was not seen as important, while the farmers paid heavy taxes because their work was importante. Fall of feudal Japan. By the 1800s, Japan's feudal system was falling apart. Merchants were getting richer, samurai were struggling to stay relevant, and the rigid class system couldn't keep up with the changing world. Then, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry showed up with his black ships and a message: open up to trade, or face the consequences. Japan tried to modernize while holding on to its traditions, but it didn't work. Western technology and industry were moving too fast, and Japan's feudal system couldn't keep up. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration officially ended the shogunate, restored power to the emperor, and abolished the samurai class. Japan quickly embraced Western ideas and transformed into a modern nation. Torture, trials, and terrible punishments. Torture was statecraft. Medieval monarchs maintained power through gruesome shows-rackings, public executions, and mock trials. These brutal spectacles served as chilling lessons, discouraging rebellion and reinforcing the ruler's absolute control. Monarchs and cruelty. How royal power utilized torture throughout history. Royal power has been intertwined with acts of cruelty and domination. For the kings and queens of the Middle Ages, torture was not just a punishment, but a deliberate tool to reinforce authority and instill fear. This exploration delves into how torture shaped monarchical power, the methods used, and the infamous rulers who wielded brutality as a symbol of control. The role of torture in monarchical power in medieval societies. Rulers often faced challenges to to their authority from rebellious factions, rival claimants, and dissenting subjects. To maintain dominance, many monarchs resorted to brutal punishments in history, ranging from public executions to imprisonment in torture chambers. These acts served dual purposes: eliminating threats and reinforcing the image of the monarch as the ultimate arbiter of justice and power. Most cruel monarchs in history, kings and queens of the Middle Ages, of the most brutal rulers in history. Monarchs like King John of England and Queen Mary I Bloody Mary stand out for their reliance on torture. King John famously ordered the starvation of his political enemies, while Queen Mary's reign was marked by the burning of Protestants at the stake. These actions underscore how queens also used torture methods to consolidate their power and eliminate opposition. The infamous legacy of royal brutality. The most cruel monarchs in history often justified their actions through divine right, claiming their authority was sanctioned by God. This belief emboldened them to employ extreme measures, with little regard for the suffering inflicted on their subjects. For an immersive look at the tools of their reigns, visit the Medieval Torture Museum in Chicago, which offers a detailed exploration of these methods. Famous victims of royal tortures. Victims were often political prisoners, accused, heretics, or even individuals caught in the crossfire of royal intrigue. Famous victims of royal torture include the Templars, who were persecuted under King Philip IV of France. Accused of heresy, many were subjected to horrific methods like the rack, which stretched their bodies to excruciating limits. The suffering of such individuals highlights the dark side of monarchical rule. How torture shaped monarchical power. Methods of controlled torture was a clear demonstration of a monarch's power over life and death. Instruments like the Iron Maiden and thumbscrews were not only tools of punishment but also psychological weapons designed to instill fear. By showcasing their willingness to use such measures, monarchs reinforced their dominance and deterred potential rebels. Learn more about these chilling practices at the Medieval Torture Museum in LA. Brutality as a warning. Public displays of torture served as stark warnings to the masses. Executions, floggings, and other punishments carried out in town squares were meant to deter criminal behavior and silence dissent. These acts symbolized the monarch's unchallengeable authority and the dire consequences of defying it. What to see in St. Augustine? For those intrigued by the historical intersection of royalty and torture, St. Augustine offers a unique perspective. The Medieval Torture Museum in St. Augustine presents exhibits that shed light on the brutal reigns of monarchs and their infamous methods. As a St. Augustine venue, the museum combines historical education with immersive displays, making it a must-see attraction. The legacy of royal cruelty. The legacy of monarchical torture is one of fear, suffering, and control. These practices, while abhorrent by modern standards, played a pivotal role in shaping the history of medieval governance. By examining the reigns of the most brutal rulers in history, we gain insight into the lengths to which rulers went to secure their power. For more stories and analysis of medieval brutality, visit the museum's detailed blog and discover the enduring impact of these dark chapters in history. The use of torture by monarchs during the Middle Ages reveals a stark reality of their reigns. Cruelty was not an aberration but a calculated tool of power. By exploring the lives of kings and queens of the Middle Ages, their victims, and their methods, we uncover the intricate relationship between fear, dominance, and royal authority. Visiting museums dedicated to these themes offers a tangible connection to this grim yet fascinating aspect of history. How political prisoners were targeted in the Middle Ages. Throughout history, Medieval rulers frequently used torture and imprisonment as tools of political suppression. Those labeled as threats, whether through rebellion, dissent, or simply opposing views, faced severe medieval punishment for political offences. Understanding how political prisoners were treated in the Middle Ages provides crucial insights into the brutal realities of medieval justice for political criminals. Medieval rulers and political prisoners in medieval Europe. Rulers had absolute authority, and maintaining power often involved harsh measures against perceived threats. Political prisoners, defined as captives held primarily for their ideological or political beliefs, experienced relentless persecution. Medieval prisons for political prisoners were notoriously grim and inhumane. Captivity often meant confinement in dungeons, characterized by darkness, isolation, and unsanitary conditions. Prisoners endured long periods chained to walls, suffering from starvation and disease, exacerbated by psychological torment. Notorious facilities like the Tower of London or Chateau d'If, if exemplified the severe brutality prisoners faced. Dungeons weren't just for holding captives, they symbolized the total authority of rulers to enforce their will through imprisonment. Torture as political suppression. Torture of political prisoners wasn't merely punitive, which was deliberately used to extract confessions, obtain information, and instill fear among the populace. Medieval authorities believed torture to be an effective interrogation technique, despite its inherent cruelty and the questionable reliability of the obtained confessions. Common torture methods included the rack, where victims were stretched to unbearable extremes, or the Iron Maiden, whose spikes inflicted severe pain and often death. Such brutality served as both punishment and a stark warning against potential rebellion. Political prisoners and the Inquisition. The Inquisition played a notorious role in targeting political prisoners, especially those accused of heresy or challenging church authority. Often, political motives intertwined with religious accusations, allowing inquisitors to justify their severe measures. Prisoners were subject to prolonged interrogation and torture, leaving lasting scars both physically and mentally. The notorious Auto da Fe public spectacle combining punishment and execution illustrates the extent of cruelty prisoners faced, emphasizing the intersection of religion, politics, and public persecution. Creepy attractions in Chicago, exploring medieval torture. Modern museums, such as the creepy attractions in Chicago at the Medieval Torture Museum, offer vivid recreations of the instruments and conditions political prisoners faced. These exhibits provide powerful, immersive experiences, illustrating the dark side of medieval history. Visitors can witness historically accurate replicas of medieval torture instruments and dungeons, bringing history vividly to life and deepening our understanding of political persecution. Discovering more across the US. For those intrigued by this chilling aspect of history, visits to other locations can further enrich understanding. The Medieval Torture Museum in Los Angeles and the Medieval Torture Museum in St. Augustine offer equally compelling explorations into medieval punishment methods and the stories behind the political prisoners who endured them. Deepen your understanding through our blog to further explore medieval punishment methods, prisoner stories, and insights into historical political suppression. Follow our regularly updated blog. It provides detailed accounts, historical analyses, and surprising insights into the brutal past. Oppression as ideology. Religious and social violence. War and religion became tools of oppression. In Europe, campaigns like the Albigensian Crusade unleashed brutal suppression, blending religious fervor with feudal power to eliminate dissent. Elsewhere, rulers issued edicts, like England's 1290 expulsion of Jews legalized. Exile and dispossession and mass killings targeted innocent communities under the guise of authority. The medieval crusade against the Cathars supplied a template for modern oppression. The French monarchy waged an infamous war of extermination against Christian heretics during the 13th century. The Albigensian Crusade was a landmark in the development of an oppressive European social order with crucial legacies for the world today. In the 13th century, the French monarchy fought a ruthless war against some of its own subjects, whom the Catholic Church had branded as heretics. Unless you have a particular interest in medieval history, you're mostly likely to have heard about the Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade from visiting the south of France, where the castles are a major part of the tourist industry. The guidebooks tend to tell a simple story of the tolerant, civilized society of the Languedoc region, which was only vaguely under the control of the French crown at the time, and to which France was a foreign country, being wiped out by ignorant northerners, with alternative religious believers persecuted by orthodox bigotry. A closer look at the history of the Crusade reveals that it was a landmark in the development of an oppressive social order throughout Europe. The ideologies that took shape to legitimize medieval oppression later supplied a template for new systems of class domination in the modern, capitalist world. The Albigensian Crusade Pope Innocent III, called the Albigensian Crusade in 1208. Crusades were holy wars instigated by the papacy to be fought by secular recruits. They were initially directed specifically against Muslims in Palestine and Spain, but became a way in which popes could attempt to mobilize secular troops against a range of papal enemies. In the case of the Albigensian Crusade, its first target was one man, Raymond Vi, Count of Toulouse, whose men had just ambushed and murdered a papal legate. The Crusaders, mostly knights from northern France, assembled at Lyons in June 1209, where Raymond of Toulouse rather neatly wrong-footed the crusade against him by joining it. Not for nothing did Innocent call him changeable and crafty, shifty, and inconstant. The Crusaders set off across Languedoc, first targeting the lands of the Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne, then more generally fighting anyone who got in their way. They were avowedly targeting heretics, but since part of their definition of a heretic was anyone who opposed the crusade, this logic was rather self-fulfilling. There is certainly no shortage of examples of brutality in the history of Albigensian Crusade. The most famous is the sack of the town of Béziers in July 1209, in which large numbers of its citizens were killed. But it was not an isolated incident. The sack of Béziers gave rise to a notorious anecdote about the man who was then leading the crusade, Arnaud Amaury, abbot of Quito. One of the knights was said to have asked Amaury how they could distinguish Orthodox Béziers citizens from the heretical ones, to which he replied, "Kill them all, God will know his own." While this story does not appear in contemporary accounts, it does typify an attitude toward the people of Languedoc widely demonstrated by the Crusaders. Even after the crusade, ecclesiastical elites continued to promote that attitude. Our evidence for Arnaud's comment, for example, comes from a guide written at a later stage for young recruits to his own Cistercian order. An anonymous chronicler from Languedoc left behind a savage portrait of Simon de Montfort, the nobleman who led the crusade until his death at the siege of Toulouse. In 1218, the crusade ended in 1229 with the establishment of effective French royal control over Languedoc. The following decade saw the foundation of an inquisition to track down heretics and make them recant, or burn them if they wouldn't. The combined effect of royal and religious rule in Languedoc was considerable. People in Languedoc still perceived themselves to be under foreign occupation well into the 14th century, when one of their spokesmen told King Philip IV of France that it was a wonder that the whole land did not tell him, "Go away, foreigner," defining heresy. This may all sound as if the Albigensian Crusade was just a standard case of medieval nastiness, without much to tell us today. A Marxist interpretation of heresy and the Crusade, however, can show that it was of considerable importance in the development of feudalism and of oppression as a ruling class tactic to increase feudal control. We can thus properly view the Albigensian Crusade as part of the history of class struggle in terms of political history. The Albigensian Crusade marks the point at which the south of France became definitively part of France, rather than a kingdom made up of Aragon, Catalonia, and Languedoc, in order to understand its wider significance. However, we need to grasp the nature of heresy. The concept of heresy basically means disobedience to the ecclesiastical authorities. While that could involve following unapproved religious doctrines, an accusation of heresy did not necessitate major doctrinal differences at all. It was possible to have orthodox beliefs, but to be labeled a heretic for disobeying the church in other ways. In medieval social conflict, religion was very often the location and the language of social protest. This was an expression not only of the church's secular power and wealth, but of its central role from the 11th century onward in the extension and intensification of feudal control. For secular powers who were prepared to work with it, the church offered in return an ideological structure that presented exploitation as being divinely ordained, as well as the prospect of increasing control over the day-to-day lives of the exploited to squeeze as much labor out of them as possible. The local church effectively pinned the feet of the peasants to the floor, and then proceeded to mandate when they worked, when they rested, and when they worshipped, all the while serving up a religious justification for the structure of society. This did not only mean that aristocratic rulers could depict resistance to feudal control as a form of heresy, criticizing the church on religious grounds, for example, for becoming wealthy and corrupt and abandoning the apostolic poverty of the early church, also constituted a challenge to the power structures of society. We can observe the reality of heresy as social protest in the careers of 12th century heretics like Arnold of Brescia in Rome and William Longbeard in London, two holy men who led class-based revolts, and Ian de l'Etoile, a Breton peasant rebel who believed he was divinely inspired to raid churches and monasteries. As well as these obviously rebellious examples, religious and secular authorities could see individuals pursuing a religious life as a problem unless one of the religious orders regulated their activity, even though they were merely following the example of the apostles in the Bible. Popular enthusiasm for apostolic poverty, and those who practiced it, was a potential challenge to the established order throughout the medieval period. A question of power. The traditional historiographical view of the issue of heresy in Languedoc sees it as approaching the formation of an alternative church. According to this version, Catharism was imported to Western Europe from Bulgaria, where there was a heretical Christian tendency known as Bogomilianism, with its dualist belief in two gods, the good God of heaven and the evil God of this world. It differed so fundamentally from Orthodox Christianity that it was effectively a different religion. This school of thought also suggests that attempted to create their own ecclesiastic hierarchy, with Cathar bishops and so on. This was an existential threat to the Church's religious monopoly. The argument effectively concludes that, while we may deprecate the Church's methods, we should appreciate the fact that they had to respond to the Cathar challenge somehow. However, there is an alternative view that notes there is very little hard evidence for the existence of organized dualism in the south of France. Far from the region being a center of Catharism, the term Cathar was never actually used in Languedoc, where heretics were more usually referred to as good men and good women, or by the Inquisition as followers of the heretical depravity. The good men and good women, wandering holy people, were widely seen not as followers of unchristian doctrine, but simply as the best Christians, with their simple, ascetic lifestyles. A man who was being arrested by the Toulouse Inquisition in 1234 made this point satirically, exclaiming that since he lied, swore, ate meat, and had sex with his wife, he couldn't possibly be a heretic. The question, though, is why figures like the good men and good women became such a heretical threat to the church in Languedoc. Comparable figures elsewhere in England, for example, may have represented a challenge to authority of their own, but they did not require the Inquisition to deal with them. The answer is a question of power. Languedoc in the 12th century was an area in which feudal control was weak. While this did not mean that it was outside the feudal system altogether, the nobility of the area often exercised real exploitative power over a surprisingly small percentage of the lands they nominally controlled. There were multiple examples of towns and villages behaving as if they were effectively independent, from the commune of Toulouse, expelling its count from the city and conducting its own wars, to the small town of Lemieux, quietly relocating itself at will. This lack of control meant that the authorities saw as outright heresy behavior that in other cases could be a merely annoying, unregulated religious asceticism. The Albigensian Crusade and the formation of the Inquisition were not an isolated reaction to this perceived threat, but part of a Europe-wide strategy for increasing elite control through the practice of the persecuting society. The persecuting society. The historian R.I. Moore developed the concept of the persecuting society, noting that the later 11th and 12th centuries saw deliberate violence beginning to be directed through state and religious institutions against people who were part of outgroups, Jews, lepers, heretics, and so on. This was not because these groups became objectively larger, and nor did it reflect a growth in individual bigotry. Rather, it was the product of a ruling class strategy aimed at increasing elite power and authority. The point was not simply to suppress certain groups, but to embark on the process of reifying and then persecuting said groups, because this process itself would improve the position of the ruling class. The oppressive activity mattered more than the putative end result. In identifying the development of the persecuting society, Moore stressed that no consideration of the cultural achievements of the Central Middle Ages could be complete without including this dark flip side. He did not take a firm position on whether Europe's 12th century Renaissance was connected to the persecuting society, commenting that this was a question historians were not called upon to answer. However, a materialist analysis of the period should make it clear that the age of the great medieval cathedrals and other cultural achievements of the time required the extraction of surplus labor in greater intensity than during previous periods. The practice of the persecuting society helped to facilitate such intensity. We can see the medieval ruling class construction of various others as the historical origin of the oppression that exists under modern capitalism. European elites developed modern racism, often consciously, from the early modern period on to justify the slave trade, yet they were not inventing a new prejudice from scratch, but rather using models inherited from the medieval period, such as the anti-Irish prejudice that accompanied the Anglo-Norman conquest of Ireland in the 12th century, or medieval anti-Semitism. The historical origins of specific oppressions, like racism, also, of course, underlines how they form part of the general use of oppression as an enabler of exploitation, which also dates back to the medieval period. The functions that the persecuting society performed to divide people, break bonds of solidarity, and provide some of the exploited class with marginal benefits from supporting rather than opposing the system, are familiar from a cursory look at modern oppression. Capitalism has continued to use and extend the strategy first developed to enable the intensification of feudal exploitation in the Central Middle Ages. Repression and resistance before the Albigensian Crusade, various nobles in Languedoc had shown a passing interest in adopting the practice of the persecuting society to increase their control, including Raymond VI's father, his predecessor as Count of Toulouse. However, the Crusade was the point at which serious ruling class resources were channeled into the transformation of authority in Languedoc along persecutory lines. The local population vigorously resisted the imposition of royal and ecclesiastical control which it enabled. In understanding the Crusade as a form of class struggle, we should see it not as an isolated event, but as the beginning of more than a century of repression and resistance. This resistance involved, in its earlier stages, opponents of the Crusade drawn from the nobility. By the end of the 13th century, however, resistance had become much more divided along class lines, culminating in the revolt of the poorer citizens of Carcassonne and Limoux. In 1303–05, the authorities routinely dubbed those resisting as heretics, but they usually did not see themselves as such, nor were they necessarily even particular adherents of the good men and good women. They were simply fighting back against exploitation and oppression. The Albigensian Crusade is one of the best known individual instances of the persecuting society. But it was not to be the last. Edict of Expulsion. The Edict of Expulsion was a royal decree expelling all Jews from the Kingdom of England that was issued by Edward I on the 18th of July, 1290. It was the first time a European state is known to have permanently banned their presence. The date of issuance was most likely chosen because it was a Jewish holy day, Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of Jerusalem and other disasters the Jewish people have experienced. Edward told the sheriffs of all counties he wanted all Jews expelled before All Saints' Day, the 1st of November that year. Jews were allowed to leave England with cash and personal possessions, but debts they were owed, homes and other buildings, synagogues and cemeteries were forfeit to the king. While there are no recorded attacks on Jews during the departure on land, there were acts of piracy in which Jews died, and others were drowned as a result of being forced to cross the English Channel at a time of year when dangerous storms are common. There is evidence from personal names of Jewish refugees settling in Paris and other parts of France, as well as Italy, Spain, and Germany. Documents taken abroad by the Anglo-Jewish diaspora have been found as far away as Cairo. Jewish properties were sold to the benefit of the Crown, Queen Eleanor, and selected individuals who were given grants of property. The edict was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of increasing anti-Semitism in England during the reigns of Henry III and Edward I. Anti-Jewish prejudice was used as a political tool by opponents of the Crown and later by Edward and the state itself. Edward took measures to claim credit for the expulsion and to define himself as the protector of Christians against Jews. And following his death, he was remembered and praised for the expulsion, The expulsion had the effect of embedding anti-Semitism into English culture of the medieval and early modern period. Such anti-Semitic beliefs included that England was unique because there were no Jews, and that the English had superseded the Jews as God's chosen people. The expulsion edict remained in force for the rest of the Middle Ages, but was overturned more than 365 years later during the Protectorate, when in 1656 Oliver Cromwell informally permitted the resettlement of the Jews in England. The first Jewish communities in the Kingdom of England were recorded sometime after the Norman conquest in 1066. Moving from William the Conqueror's towns in northern France, Jews were viewed as being under the direct jurisdiction and property of the king, making them subject to his whims. The monarch could tax or imprison Jews as he wished, without reference to anyone else. A very small number of Jews were wealthy because Jews were allowed to lend money at interest, while the church forbade Christians from doing so, which was regarded as the sin of usury. Capital was in short supply and necessary for development, including investment in monastic construction and allowing aristocrats to pay heavy taxes to the crown. So Jewish loans played an important economic role, although they were also used to finance consumption, particularly among overstretched land-holding knights. The Church's highest authority, the Holy See, had placed restrictions on the mixing of Jews with Christians, and that the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 had mandated the wearing of distinctive clothing such as tabula or Jewish badges. These measures were adopted in England at the Synod of Oxford in 1222. Church leaders made the first allegations of ritual child sacrifice, such as crucifixions at Easter in mockery of Christ, and the accusations began to develop into themes of conspiracy and occult practices. King Henry III backed allegations made against Jews of Lincoln after the death of a boy named Hugh, who soon became known as Little Saint Hugh. Such stories coincided with the rise of hostility within the church to the Jews. Discontent increased after the crown destabilized the loans and debt market. Loans were typically secured through bonds that entitled the lender to the debtor's landholdings. Interest rates were relatively high and debtors tended to be in arrears. Repayments and actual interest paid were a matter for negotiation, and it was unusual for a Jewish lender to foreclose debts. As the crown overtaxed Jews, they were forced to sell their debt bonds at reduced prices to quickly raise cash. Rich courtiers would buy the cut-price bonds and could call in the loans and demand the lands that had secured the loans. This caused the transfer of the land wealth of indebted knights and others, especially from the 1240s, as the taxation of Jews became unsustainably high. Leaders like Simon de Montfort then used anger at the dispossession of middle-ranking landowners to fuel anti-Semitic violence at London, where 500 Jews died, Worcester, Canterbury, and many other towns. In the 1270s and 1280s, Queen Eleanor amassed vast lands and properties through this process, causing widespread resentment and conflict with the Church, which viewed her acquisitions as profiting from usury. By 1275, as the result of punitive taxation, the crown had eroded the Jewish community's wealth to the extent taxes produced little return steps towards expulsion. The first major step towards expulsion took place in 1275 with the Statute of the Jury, which outlawed all lending at interest and allowed Jews to lease land, which had previously been forbidden. This right was granted for the following 15 years, supposedly giving Jews a period to readjust. This was an unrealistic expectation because entry to other trades was generally restricted. Edward I attempted to convert Jews by compelling them to listen to Christian preachers. The Church took further action. For example, John Peckham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, campaigned to suppress 7 London synagogues in 1282. In late 1286, Pope Honorius IV addressed a special letter or rescript to the Archbishops of York and Canterbury claiming Jews had an evil effect on religious life in England through free interaction with Christians, and calling for action to be taken to prevent it. Honorius's demands were restated at the Synod of Exeter. Jews were targeted in the coin-clipping crisis of the late 1270s, when over 300 Jews, over 10% of England's Jewish population, were sentenced to death for interfering with the currency. The Crown profited from seized assets and payments of fines by those who were not executed, raising at least £16,500 d. While it is unclear how impoverished the Jewish community was in these last years, historian Henry Richardson notes, Edward did not impose any further taxation from 1278 until the late 1280s. It appears some Jewish moneylenders continued to lend money against future delivery of goods to avoid usury restrictions, a practice that was wholly known to the Crown because debts had to be recorded in a government arca or chest, where debts were recorded Others found ways to continue trading, and it is likely others left the country. Expulsion of the Jews from Gascony also. Expulsions and exegesis of Jews, local or temporary expulsions of Jews, had taken place in other parts of Europe, and regularly in England. For example, Simon de Montfort expelled the Jews of Leicester in 1231, and in 1275, Edward I had permitted the Queen Mother, Eleanor, to expel Jews from her lands and towns. In 1287, Edward I was in his French provinces in the Duchy of Gascony while trying to negotiate the release of his cousin Charles of Salerno, who was being held captive in Aragon on Easter Sunday. Edward broke his collarbone in an 80-foot 24 meters fall and was confined to bed for several months. Soon after his recovery, Edward ordered the expulsion of local Jews from Gascony. His immediate motivation may have been the need to generate funds for Charles' release, but many historians, including Richard Huscroft, have said the money raised by seizures from exiled Jews was negligible and that it was given away to mendicant orders, i.e. friars, and therefore see the expulsion as a thank offering for Edward's recovery from his injury. After his release, in 1289, Charles of Salerno expelled Jews from his territories in Maine and Anjou, accusing them of dwelling randomly with the Christian population and cohabiting with Christian women. He linked the expulsion to general taxation of the population as recompense for lost income. Edward and Charles may have learnt from each other's experience. Expulsion Edict of Expulsion. The Edict of Expulsion was a royal decree expelling all Jews from the Kingdom of England that was issued by Edward on the 18th of July 1290. It was the first time a European state is known to have permanently banned their presence. The date of issuance was most likely chosen because it was a Jewish holy day, Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of Jerusalem and other disasters the Jewish people have experienced. Edward told the sheriffs of all counties he wanted all Jews expelled before All Saints' Day, the 1st of November that year. Jews were allowed to leave England with cash and personal possessions, but debts they were owed homes, and other buildings, including synagogues and cemeteries, were forfeit to the king. While there are no recorded attacks on Jews during the departure on land, there were acts of piracy in which Jews died, and others were drowned as a result of being forced to cross the English Channel at a time of year when dangerous storms are common. There is evidence from personal names of Jewish refugees settling in Paris and other parts of France, as well as Italy, Spain, and Germany. Documents taken abroad by the Anglo-Jewish diaspora have been found as far away as Cairo. Jewish properties were sold to the benefit of the crown, Queen Eleanor, and selected individuals who were given grants of property. The edict was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of increasing anti-Semitism in England. During the reigns of Henry III and Edward I, anti-Jewish prejudice was used as a political tool by opponents of the crown, and later by Edward and the state itself. Edward took measures to claim credit for the expulsion and to define himself as the protector of Christians against Jews. And following his death, he was remembered and praised for the expulsion. The expulsion had the effect of embedding anti-Semitism into English culture of the medieval and early modern period. Such anti-Semitic beliefs included that England was unique because there were no Jews, and that the English had superseded the Jews as God's chosen people. The expulsion edict remained in force for the rest of the Middle Ages, but was overturned more than 365 years later during the Protectorate, when, in 1656, Oliver Cromwell informally permitted the resettlement of the Jews in England. Back article, History of the Jews in England 1066 to 1290. The first Jewish communities in the Kingdom of England were recorded sometime after the Norman conquest in 1066, moving from William the Conqueror's towns in northern France. Jews were viewed as being under the direct jurisdiction and property of the king, making them subject to his whims. The monarch could tax or imprison Jews as he wished, without reference to anyone else. A very small number of Jews were wealthy because Jews were allowed to lend money at interest, while the church forbade Christians from doing so, which was regarded as the sin of usury. Capital was in short supply and necessary for development, including investment in monastic construction and allowing aristocrats to pay heavy taxes to the crown, so Jewish loans played an important economic role. Although they were also used to finance consumption, particularly among overstretched landholding knights, the church's highest authority, the Holy See, had placed restrictions on the mixing of Jews with Christians, and at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 had mandated the wearing of distinctive clothing such as tabular or Jewish badges. These measures were adopted in England at the Synod of Oxford in 1222. Church leaders made the first allegations of ritual child sacrifice, such as crucifixions at Easter in mockery of Christ, and the accusations began to develop into themes of conspiracy and occult practices. King Henry III backed allegations made against Jews of Lincoln after the death of a boy named Hugh, who soon became known as Little Saint Hugh. Such stories coincided with the rise of hostility within the church to the Jews. Discontent increased after the crown destabilized the loans and debt market. Loans were typically secured through bonds that entitled the lender to the debtor's landholdings. Interest rates were relatively high and debtors tended to be in arrears. Repayments and actual interest paid were a matter for negotiation, and it was unusual for a Jewish lender to foreclose debts. As the crown overtaxed Jews, they were forced to sell their debt bonds at reduced prices to quickly raise cash. Rich courtiers would buy the cut-priced bonds and could call in the loans and demand the lands that had secured the loans. This caused the transfer of the land wealth of indebted knights and others, especially from the 1240s, as the taxation of Jews became unsustainably high. Leaders like Simon de Montfort then used anger at the dispossession of middle-ranking landowners to fuel anti-Semitic violence at London, where 500 Jews died, Worcester, Canterbury, and many other towns. In the 1270s and 1280s, Queen Eleanor amassed vast lands and properties through this process. causing widespread resentment and conflict with the church, which viewed her acquisitions as profiting from usury. By 1275, as the result of punitive taxation, the crown had eroded the Jewish community's wealth to the extent taxes produced little return. See Steps towards expulsion. See also History of the Jews in England, 1066 to 1290 section. Edward I and the expulsion. The first major step towards expulsion took place in 1275 with the Statute of the Jury, which outlawed all lending at interest and allowed Jews to lease land, which had previously been forbidden. This right was granted for the following 15 years, supposedly giving Jews a period to readjust. This was an unrealistic expectation because entry to other trades was generally restricted. Edward I attempted to convert Jews by compelling them to listen to Christian preachers. Text of a statute in Latin. Extract of the Statute of the Jury. C. 1275. The Church took further action. For example, John Peckham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, campaigned to suppress 7 London synagogues. In 1282, in late 1286, Pope Honorius IV addressed a special letter or rescript to the Archbishops of York and Canterbury, claiming Jews had an evil effect on religious life in England through free interaction with Christians, and calling for action to be taken to prevent it. Honorius's demands were restated at the Synod of Exeter. Jews were targeted in the coin-clipping crisis of the late 1270s, when over 300 Jews, over 10% of England's Jewish population, were sentenced to death for interfering with the currency. The Crown profited from seized assets and payments of fines by those who were not executed, raising at least £16,500 d. While it is unclear how impoverished the Jewish community was in these last years, historian Henry Richardson notes, Edward did not impose any further taxation from 1278 until the late 1280s. It appears some Jewish moneylenders continued to lend money against future delivery of goods to avoid usury restrictions, a practice that was wholly known to the Crown because debts had to be recorded in a government arca or chest where debts were recorded. Others found ways to continue trading, and it is likely others left the country. Expulsion of the Jews from Gascony. See also expulsions and exoduces of Jews. Local or temporary expulsions of Jews had taken place in other parts of Europe, and regularly in England. For example, Simon de Montfort expelled the Jews of Leicester in 1231, and in 1275 Edward I had permitted the Queen Mother Eleanor to expel Jews from her lands and towns. In 1287, Edward I was in his French provinces in the Duchy of Gascony while trying to negotiate the release of his cousin Charles of Salerno, who was being held captive in Aragon. On Easter Sunday, Edward broke his collarbone in an 80-foot 24 meters fall and was confined to bed for several months. Soon after his recovery, Edward ordered the expulsion of local Jews from Gascony. His immediate motivation may have been the need to generate funds for Charles' release, but many historians, including Richard Huscroft, have said the money raised by seizures from exiled Jews was negligible, and that it was given away to mendicant orders, i.e. friars, and therefore see the expulsion as a thank offering for Edward's recovery from his injury. After his release, in 1289, Charles of Salerno expelled Jews from his territories in Maine and Anjou, accusing them of dwelling randomly with the Christian population and cohabiting with Christian women. He linked the expulsion to general taxation of the population as recompense for lost income. Edward and Charles may have learnt from each other's experience. Expulsion by the time he returned to England from Gascony in 1289. Edward I was deeply in debt. At the same time, his experiment to convert the Jews to Christianity and remove Their dependence on lending at interest had failed. The 15-year period in which Jews were allowed to lease farms had ended. Also, raising significant sums of money from the Jewish population had become increasingly difficult because they had been repeatedly overtaxed. In the 14th of June 1290, Edward summoned representatives of the Knights of the Shires, the middling landowners, to attend Parliament by the 15th of July. These knights were the group that was most hostile to Jews and usury. On the 18th of June, Edward sent secret orders to the sheriffs of cities with Jewish residents to seal the archy containing records of Jewish debts. The reason for this is disputed. It could represent preparation for a further tallage to be paid by the Jewish population, or it could represent a preparatory step for expulsion. Parliament met on the 15th of July. There is no record of the parliamentary debates, so it is uncertain whether the Crown offered the expulsion of the Jews in return for a vote of taxation, or whether Parliament asked for it as a concession. Both views are argued. The link between these seems certain given the evidence of contemporaneous chronicles and the speed at which orders to expel the Jews of England were made, possibly after an agreement was reached. The taxation granted by Parliament to Edward was very high. At £116,000, it was probably the highest of the Middle Ages. In gratitude, the Church later voluntarily agreed to pay tax of 1/10 of its revenue. On the 18th of July, the Edict of Expulsion was issued. The text of the edict is lost. On the Hebrew calendar, the 18th of July of that year was 9 AV Tisha B'Av, 5050, commemorating the fall of the Temple at Jerusalem. It is unlikely to be a coincidence. According to Roth, it was noted with awe by Jewish chroniclers. On the same day, writs were sent to sheriffs saying all Jews were to leave by All Saints' Day, the 1st of November, 1290, and outlining their duties in the matter. Proclamations ordering the population not to injure, harm, damage, or grieve the departing Jews were made. Wardens at the Cinque Ports were told to make arrangements for the Jews' safe passage and cheap fares for the poor, while safe conduct was arranged for dignitaries, such as the wealthy financier Bonamy of York. There were limits on the property Jews could take with them, although a few favoured persons were allowed to sell their homes before they left. The vast majority had to forfeit any outstanding debts, homes and immobile property, including synagogues and cemeteries. On the 5th of November, Edward wrote to the Barons of the Exchequer, giving the clearest known official explanation of his actions. In it, Edward said the Jews had broken trust with him by continuing to find ways to charge interest on loans. He labelled them criminals and traitors, and said they had been expelled in honour of the crucified Jesus. Interest to be paid on debts seized by the Crown was to be cancelled. The Jewish refugees, the Jewish population in England at the time of the expulsion was relatively small, perhaps as few as 2,000 people, although estimates vary. Decades of privations had caused many Jews to emigrate or convert. Although it is believed most of the Jews were able to leave England in safety, there are some records of piracy leading to the death of some expelled Jews. On the 10th of October, a ship of poor London Jews had chartered, which a chronicler described as bearing their scrolls of the law. H sailed toward the mouth of the Thames, near Queenborough, en route to France. While the tide was low, the captain persuaded the Jews to walk with him on a sandbank. As the tide rose, he returned to the ship, telling the Jews to call upon Moses for help. It appears those involved in this incident were punished. Another incident occurred in Portsmouth, where sailors received a pardon in 1294, and a ship is recorded as drifting ashore near Burnham and Crouch, Essex, the Jewish passengers having been robbed and murdered. The condition of the sea in autumn was also dangerous. Around 1,300 poor Jewish passengers crossed the English Channel to Wissant near Calais for 4D each. Tolls were collected by the Constable of the Tower of London from those leaving on their departure, of 4D or 2D for poor Jews. Some ships were lost at sea and others arrived with their passengers destitute. It is unclear where most of the migrants went. Those arriving in France were initially allowed to stay in Amiens and Carcassonne, but permission was soon revoked. Because most of the Anglo Jewry still spoke French, historian Cecil Roth speculates most would have found refuge in France. Evidence from personal names in records show some Jews with the appellation Longlash or Longlois, i.e. be English in Paris, Savoy, and elsewhere. Similar names can be found among the Spanish Jewry, and the Venetian Clerley family claimed descent from Anglo-Jewish refugees. The locations where Anglo-Jewish texts have been found is also evidence for the possible destination of migrants, including places in Germany, Italy, and Spain. The title deeds to an English monastery have been found in the wood store of a synagogue in Cairo, where, according to Roth, a refugee from England deposited the document. In the rare case of Bonamy of York, there is a record of him accidentally meeting creditors in Paris in 1292. Other individual cases can be speculated about, such as that of Licaresha of Winchester's sons Asher and Lombard, and her grandchildren, who were likely among the exiles' disposal of Jewish property following the expulsion. The Crown seized Jewish property. Debts with a value of £20,000 were collated from the archy from each town with a Jewish settlement. In December, Hugh of Kendal was appointed to dispose of the property seized from the Jewish refugees, the most valuable of which consisted of houses in London. Some of the property was given away to courtiers. The church and the royal families circle in a total of 85 grants. William Burnell received property in Oxford, which he later gave to Balliol College. For example, Queen Eleanor Taylor was granted the synagogue in Canterbury. Sales were mostly completed by early 1291, and around £2,000 was raised, £100 of which was used to glaze windows and decorate the tomb of Henry III in Westminster Abbey. It appears there was no systematic attempt to collect the £20,000 worth of seized debts. The reasons for this could include the death of Queen Eleanor in November 1290, concerns over a possible war with Scotland, or an attempt to win political favour by providing benefit to those previously indebted Jewish presence in England after the expulsionate. Is likely the few Jews remaining in England after the expulsion were converts. At the time of the expulsion, there were around 100 converted Jews in the Domos Conversorum, which provided accommodation to Jews who had converted to Christianity. The last of the pre-1290 converts, Clarissa, the daughter of Jacob Coke, died in 1356. Having spent the early part of the 1300s in Exeter, where she raised a family. Between the expulsion of the Jews in 1290 and their informal return in 1655, there continue to be records of Jews in the Domus Conversorum up to and after 1551. The expulsion is unlikely to have been wholly enforceable, for complaints were made to the king in 1376 that some of those trading as Lombards were actually Jews. Propagandising. The expulsion. After the expulsion, Edward I sought to position himself as the defender of Christians against the supposed criminality of Jews. Most prominently, he continued personal veneration of little Saint Hugh of Lincoln, a child whose death had been falsely attributed to ritual murder by Jews. After the death of his wife, Queen Eleanor, in late 1290, Edward reconstructed the shrine, incorporating the royal coat of arms. in the same style as the Eleanor crosses. It appears to have been an attempt by Edward to associate himself and Eleanor with the cult, according to historian Joe Hillaby. This propaganda coup boosted the circulation of the St. Hugh myth, the most famous of the English blood libels, which is repeated in literature and the Sir Hugh folk songs into the 20th century. Other efforts to justify the expulsion can be found in the church. For instance, in the canonization evidence submitted for Thomas de Cantilupe, the permanent expulsion of Jews from England and tactics employed before it, such as attempts at forced conversion, are widely seen as setting a significant precedent and an example for the 1492 Alhambra Decree. Traditional narratives of Edward I have sought to downplay the event, emphasizing the peacefulness of the expulsion or placing its roots in Edward's pragmatic need to extract money from Parliament. More recent work on the Anglo-Jewish community's experience have framed it as the culmination of a policy of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. These studies place the expulsion in the context of the execution of Jews for coin-clipping and the first royal-sponsored attempts at converting Jews to Christianity, saying this was the first time a state had permanently expelled all Jews from its territory. For Edward I's contemporaries, there is evidence the expulsion was seen as one of his most prominent achievements. It was named alongside his wars of conquest in Scotland and Wales in the Commendatio that was widely circulated after his death, saying Edward I outshone the pharaohs by exiling the Jews. The expulsion had a lasting effect on medieval and early modern English culture. Anti-Semitic narratives became embedded in the idea of England as unique because it had no Jews, and of the English as God's chosen people, superseding the Jews. Jews became an easy target of literature and plays, and tropes such as child sacrifice and host desecration persisted. Jews began to settle in England after 1656, and formal equality was achieved by 1858. According to medieval historian Colin Richmond, English anti-Semitism left a legacy of neglect of this topic in English historical research as late as the 1990s. The story of Little St. Hugh was repeated as fact in local guidebooks in Lincoln in the 1920s, and a private school was named after Hugh around the same time. The logo of the school, which referenced the story, was altered in 2020 Massacre of 1391. The Massacre of 1391, also known as the Pogroms of 1391, refers to a murderous wave of mass violence committed against the Jews of Spain by the Catholic populace in the crowns of Castile and Aragon in 1391. It was one of the most lethal outbreaks of violence against Jews in medieval Spain and in medieval European history. Anti-Jewish violence then continued throughout the Reconquista, culminating in the 1492 expulsion of the Jews from Spain. The first wave in 1391 marked the extreme of such violence. Under duress, Jews began to convert en masse to Roman Catholicism across the Iberian Peninsula after the massacre, resulting in a substantial population of conversos, known as Marranos. Catholics then began to accuse the conversos of secretly maintaining Jewish practices, and of thus undermining the newly united kingdom's nascent national identity. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered the expulsion of Jews who had not converted to Catholicism. The resulting diaspora came to be known as the Sephardic history of the Jews in Spain to 1391. The earliest archaeological evidence of a Jewish presence in Iberia is a 2nd century CE gravestone from Merida. Though their arrival may predate this, possibly with Phoenician traders or during Carthaginian rule, Conditions for Jews worsened significantly after the late 6th century when the rulers of the Visigothic kingdom converted to the Nicene Creed. Following the 8th century Umayyad conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, Jews in Al-Andalus lived under the DMI system. The 10th and 11th centuries are often considered a golden age of Jewish culture in Spain, marked by flourishing religious, cultural, and economic life, including Hebrew Bible studies and secular Hebrew poetry. The fall of the Caliphate of Cordoba in 1031 and the Almohad invasion of the mid-12th century are considered the end of the Golden Age, and many Jews fled to North Africa or to Christian kingdoms. Al-Andalus existed for 7 centuries, 710-1492, a period known in Spain as the Reconquest, and defined by conflict with northern Christian kingdoms. By 1391, any golden age had passed. Jews faced persecution and anti-Semitic mob violence. Throughout the 14th century in the Christian kingdoms of Spain, under Christian rule, Jews faced higher taxes than Catholics, and were largely confined to marginal occupations like banking and finance, particularly tax collection and money lending. This fueled economic anti-Semitism, with accusations of usury and market manipulation, official church anti-Semitism, including deicide and blood libel accusations, further inflamed attitudes. The Council of Vienne in 1311-1312 negated remaining civil liberties for Jews in Muslim Al-Andalus background. To violence. 1352-1390 Peter of Castile, the 30th of August, 1334 to 23 March, 1369, known as Don Pedro and Peter the Cruel in some English-language histories, was King of Castile and Leon from 1350 to 1369. He was excommunicated by Pope Urban V for his anti-clericalism, while branded a heretic by the Church. Peter gained a reputation as protector of the Jews, particularly in light of the policies of half-brother arch-rival and his eventual murderer and usurper Henry of Trastamara. The 13th of January 1334-29 May 1379, known as El Fratrezeda, as an avowed rebel and Peter's upstart rival. Henry had his forces murder over 1,200 Jews in 1355 in the province of Asturias alone. Additional massacres followed in 1360 and 1366. Henry's accession to the throne in 1369 as Henry II of Castile meant that the much larger Jewish population of Castile had not only lost their de facto royal protection, but were also likely to become targets for legally sanctioned violence. As king, Henry was as hostile to the Jews as Peter had been friendly. In order to pay the mercenaries he had employed in his long campaigns, Henry imposed a war contribution of 20,000 gold doubloons on the already heavily oppressed Jewish community of Toledo. Henry then ordered the internment of all the Jews of Toledo and denied them food and water. He next ordered the state to confiscate their property, which he then had sold at auction to enrich the crown. Nonetheless, Henry's dire financial straits compelled him to take out loans to cover his expenses. This meant both borrowing from Jewish financiers and ordering his tax collectors, so Jews, to collect ever more burdensome taxes from his Catholic subjects. He named the prominent Jew Don Joseph as his chief tax collector, Contador Major, and appointed several Jews as farmers of the taxes. Don Joseph would later be murdered by rival co-religionists. The royal councils, municipal parliaments in Toro and in Burgos then issued new demands on the Jews. In 1369, 1374, and 1377, those measures harmonized with Henry's inclinations toward persecution. Henry ordered Jews to wear a yellow badge and forbade them to use Christian names. He further ordered that, for short-term loans, Christian debtors were to repay only 2/3 of the principal, thus further impoverishing the Jewish lenders. Shortly before his death in 1379, Henry declared that Jews would no longer be permitted to hold public office. Archdeacon Martinez Ferrand Martinez FL, 14th century, was a Spanish cleric and archdeacon of Ecija, Andalusia, and most noted for being the agitator whom historians cite as the prime mover behind the massacres of 1391. Violence began in the Andalusian capital of Seville. Little is known of Martinez's early life before taking up the position at Ecija. He was the confessor of the Queen Mother of the Crown of Aragon. He called for persecution of the Jews in his homilies and speeches, claiming that he was obeying God's commandment. King John I of Castile and Martinez S. Church Superior Father Barroso, the Primate of Spain, ordered Martinez to cease his incitement. Martinez ignored them both. For more than a decade, Martinez continued his verbal attacking, telling Catholics to expel the Jews ... and to demolish their synagogues. Though put on trial in 1388, he was never curtailed by the king, though John I did state that the Jews must not be maltreated. The tipping point occurred when both John I and Barroso died in 1390, leaving John's 11-year-old son, Henry III of Castile, to rule under the regency of his mother. Martinez continued his campaign against the Jews of Seville, calling on clergy and laypeople to destroy synagogues and seize Jewish holy books and other precious items. These events led to another royal order that removed Martinez from his office and ordered damaged synagogues to be repaired at church expense. Martinez, declaring that neither the state nor the local church authorities had power over him, again ignored the commands. The first anti-Jewish riots began in Seville in March 1391. The first of the great massacres occurred on the 6th of June. Violence in Seville and Castile. Archdeacon Martinez continued to stir up the people against Jews as he preached that they should be forced to convert to Catholicism. Violence finally erupted on the 6th of June in Seville, when Catholic mobs murdered some 4,000 Jews and destroyed their houses. Those who escaped death were forced to accept baptism. Over the course of the year, the massacres would spread to all of Spain. These events inaugurated the beginning of the mass conversions, as fear gripped the Jewish communities of Spain. Within 3 months, the violence had spread to more than 70 other cities and towns, as city after city followed the example set in Seville, and Jews faced either conversion and baptism or death. Their homes were attacked, and the authorities did nothing to stop or prevent the violence and pillaging of the Jewish people. As this fanaticism and persecution spread throughout the rest of the Kingdom of Castile, there was no accountability held for the murders and sacking of the Jewish houses, and estimations say that there were 50,000 victims. Violence in Valencia and Aragon. This religious mob spread to Aragon, as the authorities did not prevent the same pattern of plunder, murder, and fanaticism. About 100,000 Jews in Aragon converted, rather than face death or attempt to flee. The violence next spread to Valencia, in the Crown of Aragon. On the 28th of June, Queen Violent of Bar ordered city officials to be especially protective of Jews. However, the situation continued to escalate, and in July, Prince Martin, King John I's brother, was placed in charge of protecting Jews against persecution. Martin had gallows set up outside the Jewish area as a threat to those who would be inclined to attack Jews. Extra surveillance for security and criers proclaimed that Jews were under the crown's protection. On the 6th of July, the Crown ordered the criers to cease. Catholic mobs began to act on the 9th of July, commencing with crowds throwing stones at royal guards and, against Martin's explicit demands, began attacking Jews with improvised weapons. The mob then began to murder, mass rape, and loot. Prince Martin recorded that the mob murdered some 2,300 Jews out of a community of 2,500 and forced the 200 who survived to convert. Archdeacon Martin declared the violence a divine judgment against the Jews. King John was present at the attack, trying to prevent it. King John criticized his brother's minimal punishments for such brazen disobedience to the crown, and said that he would have had 300 to 400 people killed, but now they must put the law on hold and serve punishment on their own. Overall, around 11,000 Jews in Valencia converted rather than face death or expulsion. Aftermath to the massacre of 1391. Only isolated instances of voluntary Jewish conversion to Catholicism had occurred in the Iberian Peninsula. Some Jewish converts gained notoriety as Christian polemicists. However, such cases were exceptional. The overall number of conversions remained insignificant. After the massacre, many more Jews began to convert to Catholicism, giving rise to a substantial Marrano population. Strong Jewish cultural, familial, and ideological ties persisted among the conversos. Rabbinic authorities, categorizing conversos as anusim or forced ones, affirmed their continued Jewish identity despite the conversion. The prevalence of crypto-Judaism among conversos further complicated Catholic perceptions, fueling distrust and jealousy towards this group. Spaniards from traditionally Catholic families called themselves Old Catholics, further singling out conversos. The ensuing decades witnessed a crescendo of anti-converso measures and violent outbursts, culminating in the wholesale expulsion of Jews from Spain 100 years after the massacre, in 1492. Sephardic Jews. Main article. Sephardic Jews. The term Sephardic Jews or Sephardim is the Jewish ethnonym for the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who were forced to convert to Catholicism or face expulsion from Spain after the Alhambra decree. The name Sephardic comes from the Hebrew word for Spain, Sepharad. The vast majority of conversos remained in Spain and Portugal, and their descendants, who number in the millions, live in both of these countries. 100,000 to 300,000 Jews did leave Spain after 1492. Estimates vary and settled in different parts of Europe and the Maghreb. While some migrated as far as the Indian subcontinent, the majority of whom reverted, many settled in parts of the Ottoman Empire, including the Maghreb, where the community was known as Megarashim, and the Levant at the behest of Sultan Bayezid II. Factors both internal and external to the Sephardim culture resulted in a continuity of tradition and the presence of a substantial Sephardic population around the globe in the 21st century, including in the United States. Sephardic Jews are one of the major Jewish ethnic divisions, alongside their Ashkenazi and Mizrahi counterparts. Historian Yoel Marciano has argued that the forced conversions contributed to the resurgence of Kabbalah studies among the Sephardim population of Spain in the early 15th century and in the diaspora following expulsion. Sephardic Bunai Anusim is a modern term for the contemporary descendants of the original conversos. Disappearing rights peasant. Revolts crushed in blood. Even rebellion carried a steep price. The 996 Norman Revolt over hunting rights ended in horrific retribution, hands and feet cut off, eyes burned out, lives snuffed by fire. Such suppression served to terrify the populace into submission and protect lordly dominance. Peasants' Revolt of 996 in Normandy. The Norman Peasants' Revolt in 996 was a revolt against the Norman nobility. The revolt was ultimately defeated by the nobles under the early reign of Richard II, Duke of Normandy. His uncle Rodolphe of Ivry was the regent of Normandy during the revolt. The revolt was started in 996, after the peasants had met in local assemblies conventicular throughout Normandy. The revolt was coordinated by a central assembly conventus that was formed by members of the local assemblies. Each conventicular sent 2 representatives to the central assembly. The peasants wanted concessions on various economic grievances. One reason in particular included local barons harassing the peasants with vexatious services. The main reason, however, was the removal of hunting rights for the lower classes. Peasants were no longer able to hunt even a single deer. 51 medieval sources claim that the revolt was caused by demands of free hunting and fishing rights. The revolt probably only affected the Seine Valley rather than the whole of Normandy. Dating of the revolt in 996 has also been disputed. The revolt may have been a reaction to the rise of serfdom in Normandy. It has been suggested that the revolt resulted in abolishing serfdom in Normandy. Citation needed lack of serfdom in Normandy has also been linked to the depopulation of coastal France brought by extensive warfare during the time period. However, evidence for existence and extent of serfdom has been difficult to obtain. Peasant leaders who brought complaints to the regent Rodolphe of Ivry had their hands and feet cut off. After they were captured, others were blinded, impaled, or burnt alive, and small landowners were made to forfeit their land. 51 despite the revolt at the start of his reign. The rest of the Richard II's rule was very peaceful. In May 1023 he did not implement the peace of God, due to the calm situation in his lands. However, Norman culture retained more of its Frankish and Gallo-Roman characteristics, and eventually lost its Scandinavian influences. Seeds of change. When darkness sparks, desperation, oppression bred resilience. King John's tyranny led to the Magna Carta, a progressive demand for rights and rule of law. In Japan, rigid enforcement by Hideyoshi disarming peasants and enforcing fief lockdowns ultimately centralized power. These crises marked turning points, foundations for reform and, sometimes, gradual freedom. The top 10 most evil people of medieval times. The medieval period, which lasted from around 476 to 1485, was a tumultuous time in history. During this period, there were many people who became notorious for their cruelty and evil deeds. Today, we are going to look at the top 10 evil people of medieval times. 1. Vlad III, the Impaler. Vlad III, the Impaler, also known as Vlad Dracula, was one of the most notorious people to make it onto our list of evil people during the medieval period. He was a ruler of Wallachia, modern-day Romania, and made his name as a cruel and merciless tyrant. He was born in 1431 and ruled Wallachia from 1456 to 1462. He gained his moniker due to his barbaric practice of impaling his enemies on stakes. Estimates of how many people he killed vary, but it's believed to be around 100,000 people. Aside from impalement, he was known for his viciousness in battle, his cruelty towards the poor, and his harsh punishments for those who crossed him. He is considered one of the top 10 evil people of medieval times for his brutal tactics and murderous ways. 2. Ivan the Terrible. Levon the Terrible is an infamous name on the list of evil people during the medieval period. He reigned from 1533 to 1584 and was one of the top 10 evil people of medieval times. He was the first Tsar of all Russia, and he is remembered for his bloody reign and extreme cruelty. He was known for his harsh treatment of criminals, which included floggings and torture, as well as executions. He also instigated a number of wars with neighboring countries in order to expand Russia's borders. He is particularly remembered for the massacre of Novgorod in 1570, in which he massacred thousands of innocent people. Ivan the Terrible was a tyrannical ruler whose cruelty earned him a place on this list of the most evil people in medieval times. 3. Genghis Khan. One of the most notorious figures in the list of evil people during the medieval period, Genghis Khan was a Mongol ruler who reigned from 1206 to 1227. He was known for his ruthlessness and brutality, conquering many territories and creating the largest contiguous empire in the world at that time. Genghis Khan is renowned for his military tactics and strategic use of psychological warfare, which he employed to great success against his enemies. He was also known for his brutality, using extreme measures to force submission from those who opposed him, including torture and mass executions. 4. Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun is one of the most infamous people of the medieval period, appearing in the top 10 list of evil people during this time. Born in 434 AD, he was the leader of the Hunnic Empire and was a ruthless conqueror, conquering vast swathes of Europe and the Middle East. He is remembered as a fierce warrior who pillaged and destroyed with no remorse, devastating entire cities and populations along his path. Attila is often considered one of the most evil people of medieval times and even earned himself the nickname the Scourge of God for his violent nature and reputation for ruthlessness. 5. Andronikos the First Komnenos, Byzantine Emperor 1183-5. Andronikos I. Komnenos is one of the most infamous names on the list of evil people during the medieval period. He was the Byzantine Emperor from 1183 to 1185, and he is widely remembered for his cruel and tyrannical reign. Andronikos the First Komnenos was known for his temper and brutality, as well as for his opulence and extravagance. He would not hesitate to execute anyone who dared to oppose him, including members of his own family. Even though he was very powerful, he was eventually overthrown by the people of Constantinople in 1185, leading to the end of his short-lived rule. For this reason, he has earned a place among the top 10 evil people of medieval times, say San Pedro the Cruel, King of Castile, and Leon 1350-69 Pedro the Cruel, also known as Pedro I of Castile, is a major figure among the list of evil people during the medieval period and was included in the top 10 evil people of medieval times. It is said that he had ordered the deaths of many people and even ordered his own son to be executed for treason. In addition, Pedro the Cruel would often torture and execute anyone who opposed or criticized him. In addition to his tyranny, Pedro the Cruel was also known for his vicious wars with other kingdoms such as Portugal and Granada. Despite his cruelty, he is often remembered as a heroic figure in some parts of Spain due to his strong commitment to Castilian independence. In any case, Pedro the Cruel remains one of the most notorious figures of the medieval period and will certainly remain one of the top 10 evil people of medieval times. 7. John, King of England, 1199 to 1216. John was a medieval English king who ruled from 1199 to 1216. He is listed among the top 10 evil people of medieval times for his cruelty and tyranny during his reign. He is known for treating his own people harshly, confiscating their property, and subjecting them to cruel punishments. He also showed great disregard for the law, often disregarding it to suit his own interests. He was also guilty of imprisoning and executing political opponents on trumped-up charges. 8. William the Bad, King of Sicily, 1154 to 66. William the Bad, also known as William I of Sicily, was one of the most notorious evil people during the medieval period. He was the king of Sicily from 1154 to 1166, and is remembered for his cruel rule of the island. During his reign, William established a system of oppression and terror, making him one of the most infamous rulers in history. He was known for torturing his prisoners and often engaging in acts of extreme brutality. He is included in the list of top 10 evil people of medieval times for his cruelty and atrocities towards his people. 9. Sviatopolk, the accursed Grand Prince of Rus. 1015. Sviatopolk was one of the most notorious rulers of the medieval period. He earned his title of the Accursed due to his cruel and oppressive reign over Rus, a loose federation of East Slavic peoples. During his time as Grand Prince, he implemented a variety of ruthless policies that made him one of the most evil people of medieval times. Sviatopolk also was known for ordering assassinations of various prominent figures in order to secure his position as Grand Prince, including the murder of his own brother. He was also infamous for cruelty towards the general population, often imposing heavy taxes and seizing lands from commoners in order to consolidate his power. Sviatopolk's violent and cruel rule makes him a worthy inclusion on our list of top 10 evil people of medieval times. 10. Christian the Tyrant, King of Norway and Denmark. 1513 to 23. Christian the Tyrant was one of the most notorious villains on the list of evil people during the medieval period. He was the king of Norway and Denmark from 1513 to 23, and he ruled with an iron fist. Christian earned his moniker as the Tyrant through his brutal and oppressive reign, which included heavy taxation and restrictions on personal liberties. He was a master of manipulation, using intimidation and fear to control his subjects. He also had a penchant for executing those who disagreed with him. Christian is remembered as one of the top 10 evil people of medieval times, and is remembered for his cruelty and callous disregard for human life.